Welcome everyone to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute, and I'm also joined today by my colleague Dr. John Wong, who is also a member of the Institute. We are very happy today to welcome to the webinar Dr. Philip Tai, who is an associate professor in history at Northeastern University. Philip received his PhD from Stanford in 2013, and then for a long time, or already during his PhD, of course, worked on the history of smuggling in modern China, and that was also what his first book was about, that came out called China's War on Smuggling, that came out in 2018 from Columbia University Press. And his new project, which as I understand it, he is going to talk to us about today, deals with underground economies across Greater Asia in the Cold War. So somewhat related to his previous topic, certainly, but we're all very excited to learn more about it. His paper that he's going to give us today is titled Vice City, Hong Kong in the Anglo-American War on Drugs 1970 to 1979. Before I hand it over to Philip, I have two more sort of housekeeping remarks. First of all, this webinar is actually co-sponsored and co-organized with a new project we have at the Institute called Delta on the Move, the Becoming of the Greater Bay Region, 1700 to 2000, which is sort of a new project we're starting to look at the historical roots and becoming of the Greater Bay Area and its global connections. And of course, in that sense, Philip's talk fits in very well with that. And secondly, this is the format of the talk is a webinar, so please, if you have any questions for Dr. Tai, please submit them to us through the Q&A button in Zoom. And then after Dr. Tai's talk, he will talk for around half an hour. We will then read out the questions and Dr. Tai can reply to them. Okay, Philip, if you are ready, then you can begin.
Can you see my screen now, my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ghassan, for that very kind introduction. I want to first thank the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences for hosting this event. I want to especially thank Ghassan and John for organizing the Chinese Business History webinar. They've done a really great job for some time now, bringing together scholars from around the world. And I'm very grateful that they've given me an opportunity to share my research with everyone. And of course, I want to thank everyone for attending this talk wherever you are in the world. To conserve some bandwidth, I'm just going to stop my own webcam, my video, but I'll turn it back on for the Q&A. So I'm going to stop the video, my camera now, but I hope you can still see my PowerPoint, right? Okay, I'm just going to assume that that's a yes. Okay, perfect. Well, this presentation is an offshoot of my new project, which Ghassan mentioned. It looks at the underground economies across what I call Greater China during the Cold War: Communist China, Nationalist Taiwan, British Hong Kong, and Portuguese Macau. I found some very interesting materials while I was doing research in 2019 on this specific topic on the Anglo-American War on Drugs. I originally planned to finish a draft of this article in 2020, but the pandemic broke out and I became a new father, so my timeline has been completely thrown off. Nonetheless, I'm looking to restart my research and writing very soon. My ideas are very much still under development, and I would especially welcome any feedback that you might have. In fact, this is the first time I'm going to be presenting this research, and I think it's very fitting that I present this paper in Hong Kong, well, virtually in Hong Kong, I suppose. I'm going to talk a bit about the background behind my research and what sort of interventions I'm going to make, but let me start by offering two different scenes, two different events to frame my presentation. The first event occurred in Hong Kong. So on the morning of June 16, 1971, Hong Kong police raided a ground floor flat in the urban jungle of Kowloon City. They arrested a couple and they seized 84 pounds of morphine worth an estimated retail value of 2.25 Hong Kong dollars, 2.25 million Hong Kong dollars. Now, despite this very outsized haul, this raid only received a very small mention in the local newspaper, which you see right here. By this time, these kinds of busts were very common in Hong Kong. So that's the first event. The other event occurred in Washington, D.C. So on the next day, thousands of miles away in the United States, President Richard Nixon held a major press conference. Flanked by senior government officials, Nixon delivered what would later be hailed as his war on drugs speech. Now, in the speech, Nixon declared that America's public enemy number one was drug abuse, which at the time he claimed was ravaging American cities and families. To fight and defeat this enemy, he argued that it was necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. He vowed that his administration would spare no resources in this war, and if necessary, he would go to Congress to double the budget for his anti-drug campaign. Most importantly, Nixon vowed that he would take the campaign beyond the United States as part of a worldwide offensive. Drug abuse may be a domestic issue, but in Nixon's mind, the problem was global. So at the same time that these events occurred, the raid in Hong Kong and the speech in Washington, D.C., they had nothing to do with one another. One was a routine bust, the other was a major policy announcement. But in the following years, these parallel campaigns waged against drug trafficking by Hong Kong and the United States would begin to converge. And indeed, throughout the 1970s, American, British, and Hong Kong officials worked very closely to stem the flow of narcotics from Southeast Asia to the rest of the world. Their joint crackdown raided drug laboratories, intercepted trawlers on the oceans, arrested scores and scores of petty traffickers, and even nabbed a few drug kingpins. Yet despite these high-profile efforts, the unprecedented cooperation by these three governments only made a small dent in the global volume of narcotics trafficking. Southeast Asia continued exporting opium and narcotics around the world. Heroin consumption in the United States continued to rise, and Hong Kong remained a trafficking hub. But, just because this Anglo-American drug war in Hong Kong proved to be ineffective in the long run, it was by no means insignificant. Because the Anglo-American War on Drugs did have several important consequences. It helped improve relations between the United States and Great Britain. These two Cold War allies worked very closely in Europe, but they disagreed over many issues in Asia. And this war on drugs in Hong Kong helped bring the two countries closer together. The war on drugs also had other consequences for Hong Kong itself. It was part of the colonial government's effort to improve its legitimacy during the 1970s, ultimately helping to strengthen colonial rule over Hong Kong. And more broadly, I believe that the Anglo-American War on Drugs touch on several historiographical issues. So I think that this case offers another perspective on the Cold War, especially Hong Kong in the Cold War. There has been a lot of research done recently on Hong Kong in the Cold War, and they often look at Hong Kong's relationship between, say, the People's Republic or the Republic of China, or they look at Hong Kong as part of Sino-British relations or Sino-American relations. Now, by contrast, I want to consider Hong Kong in the Cold War from a very different angle. I also think this episode offers another perspective on Hong Kong and globalization. Now, there's been a lot of research on Hong Kong's emergence as an export hub, a financial capital, and even a cultural center during the late 20th century. Culture, I mean by its very prolific films. Looking at the war on drugs is a reminder of how Hong Kong participated in globalization, albeit a much darker and less savory side. And finally, I hope this history contributes to the broader history of global narcotics. So researchers have looked at the history of narcotics trafficking in the early 20th century and the late 20th century, especially cocaine from Latin America, opium from Turkey and from Southeast Asia. But I want to highlight Hong Kong's pivotal role in this history, which again, I hope offers some different perspectives about Hong Kong's role in global history. So this is the agenda for my talk. First, I'm going to provide an overview of Hong Kong in the global narcotics traffic during the 1970s, and I'll discuss how Hong Kong became the so-called pusher of the Orient, dealer of the Orient. Then I'm going to look at the Anglo-American war on drugs in Hong Kong. I'm going to try to understand why these three governments came to cooperate, what forms did their cooperation take. And then I'm going to shift the perspective from Anglo-American officials to the Hong Kong Chinese public. And here, in looking at the local consequences of a global campaign, I'm going to examine how the Hong Kong public welcomed the anti-narcotics campaign. They welcomed it as part of a broader anti-crime campaign. And then I'm going to conclude with a few tentative thoughts about this Anglo-American war on drugs. And I welcome very much any sort of feedback or thoughts that any of you might have. So let me begin with Hong Kong in the global narcotics traffic. So by the 1970s, Hong Kong had already emerged as a major center of manufacturing, export, tourism, and finance. It was firmly embedded within the global economy. Narratives of the rise of Hong Kong usually center around the 60s and 70s. This was the time when Hong Kong as we know it sort of came into being. But this emergence of Hong Kong as a major center of export during the 1970s also coincided with the emergence of Hong Kong as a major center of narcotics. Hong Kong was, of course, founded as a British colony after the First Opium War in the 19th century, so drugs are integral to Hong Kong's history. But by the early 1970s, drugs were readily available for sale in the colony, and drug abuse was very pervasive. Some estimates at the time claimed that Hong Kong had the highest number of addicts in the world on a per capita basis. Now, narcotics, however, was not just a local concern for Hong Kong. In fact, the colony was enmeshed in a much larger network. By the early 1970s, Hong Kong was also a major hub in the global narcotics traffic. Opium and morphine produced in the Golden Triangle of Thailand, Laos, and Burma in Southeast Asia would find their way into Hong Kong. Given its international nature, this traffic had many participants, but this traffic was largely dominated by the Qiuzhou or Chaozhou or Dejiu ethnic group. The Qiuzhou diaspora stretched across Southeast Asia from Hong Kong to Thailand, leveraging ethnic ties that helped facilitate this trafficking. Now, once the opium and the morphine arrived in Hong Kong, they would be used by so-called chemists or cooks to produce heroin. Heroin number 3 was less pure, but also less expensive, making it more widely consumed domestically in Hong Kong. Heroin number 4 required more effort, more resources to produce, but it was more pure, more expensive, so it was mostly created and marketed for export. So how did drugs get to and from Hong Kong? Well, one common route came through air traffic. Narcotics hidden in luggage or cargo flowed easily through Kai Tak Airport, which was connected to cities worldwide. The same drivers that made Hong Kong a major export hub also helped make the city a major narcotics hub. Now, most of the opium and morphine, however, were actually shipped by sea. Fishing trawlers from Thailand, which could carry more cargo at a much lower cost, they served as the primary vectors of this traffic. These trawlers were numerous, difficult to monitor. They looked very unassuming, making them very ideal vehicles for trafficking. Now, once the opium and morphine arrived in Hong Kong, they were then funneled into laboratories or warehouses across the colony for heroin production. These laboratories and warehouses, they varied in scale. Some were big, some were small, but they were all very modest for the most part. Some of the most common heroin manufacturing facilities were located in farms or warehouses sprinkled throughout the new territories, which, as many of you know, was overwhelmingly rural back in the 1970s. But I should also note that heroin manufacturing also operated on a much smaller scale. Many flats, many apartments in the urban jungles of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, they also served as manufacturing centers. In these flats or apartments, heroin was produced in kitchens using very rudimentary tools. These are photos from an actual drug bust. These rudimentary tools and this very small scale shows you how the barriers to entry, if we can think of it as a market, the barriers to entry in heroin production were relatively low. So this was something that could be done almost anywhere, and it was done almost anywhere. Now, by the early 1970s, the global market for opium and heroin was still mostly supplied by Turkey. But the Turkish pipeline, also known as the French Connection, was soon closed by the United States, working in concert with its allies. This closure actually increased the relative importance of Southeast Asia, and by extension, Hong Kong, in supplying opium to the world market. So the closure of one pipeline merely shifted trafficking to another pipeline. Now, this trafficking became serious enough that the American government, especially the Nixon administration, thought that this was a very important problem. Drugs were apparently flooding the United States, or at least perceived to be flooding through the United States. So this was coming at a very dangerous, this influx of drugs was alarming both the US government and the American public. I should also note that this urgency to wage war against drugs and drug abuse was not just driven by the Nixon administration. I should also note that the United States Congress at this time still dominated by the Democratic Party, the opposing party to the president, the United States Congress was also very active in wading into this debate. In fact, by the early 1970s, the United States Congress held several high-profile hearings that expressed alarm at this growing problem in the United States. One of the very first signs that this was becoming a serious problem, that heroin abuse was becoming a serious problem, was the number of addicts, mostly American servicemen serving in Vietnam, traveling to Hong Kong for rest and recreation or vacation, and then coming back to the United States addicted. There was one estimate that among American servicemen in Vietnam, a 1971 congressional investigation estimated that as much as 15% of all troops in Vietnam, which was roughly 78,000 servicemen, were addicted to heroin. And when they came back to the United States, they were effectively importing or bringing back that problem home. Now, much of this official attention and public attention about the heroin epidemic were primarily focused on the Turkish pipeline and the Golden Triangle. These were the primary targets of American official and public attention. But numerous congressional investigations and media reports also shined a very, very unflattering light on Hong Kong's role in this global narcotics traffic. So these official critiques of Hong Kong's notoriety were echoed in the popular press. So stories like these of the colony of Hong Kong experiencing a big crime rise and Hong Kong's emergence as this key Far East dope center. These were already widely reported in the American media by the early 1970s. These sensational and very bleak stories painted Hong Kong as this nest of crime and drugs. And very frequently, these stories also shined a very unflattering light on the colonial government of Hong Kong. They pointed to the ineffectiveness of the British, the inability of the British to police their own colony as a major reason for all this trafficking. And we can see American frustration with colonial authorities in Hong Kong in several ways. So for instance, in its 1973 report, the US House Committee on Foreign Affairs identified Hong Kong as this very pivotal, having this very pivotal position in Southeast Asia, and urged American officials looking to curb trafficking from the Golden Triangle to also give high priority to the Crown Colony. This is a serious target that American officials should consider. But even as the United States was able to station American law enforcement officers and diplomats in Hong Kong to help with this, to help fight this trafficking, their efforts, according to this report, foundered on the supposed stubbornness or the obstinacy of British authorities. Now, according to this report, United States agents do not work as closely with their Hong Kong counterparts as they do in Southeast Asia. The situation is due in part to the traditional British attitude, which holds that they, the British, know how to do the job and require no external assistance in carrying it out. So to what extent is this characterization accurate? It's not important, as the fact that both the American government and the American public believed it to be so. I don't know what the actual, my impression is that the level of cooperation between American and Hong Kong law enforcement official in the early 1970s was pretty good. But it's not important whether this was actually, whether British agents or the Hong Kong government was aloof in its attitude. That's not important, as the fact that American officials and the American public thought that it was true. So American frustration with Hong Kong and British ineffectiveness reached a boiling point of sorts in August of 1973. That's when Lester Wolff arrived with a congressional delegation to New York. Lester Wolff was a New York congressman whose district in Queens, New York, was at that time ravaged by the heroin epidemic. For several years, Congressman Wolff had called for tougher measures, like economic sanctions or cutting off American aid to compel countries to cooperate with the United States in battling drug trafficking. So when Wolff arrived in Hong Kong, he expressed his frustrations with the colonial government, and he hinted that the United States might need to resort to sanctions if the British do not step up. Now, Wolff would later claim that he was misunderstood, and he would later soften his critical tone. But his threat, or intimating this threat, reflected a deeper American frustration with British efforts. And not surprisingly, the British and Hong Kong governments took offense at such American criticism. Now, publicly, they claimed that Hong Kong was already doing everything possible to fight narcotics in the colony, and that British officials were cooperating fully already with American officials. And they resented Hong Kong being cast as this villain in the World Drug War. And they also reminded Americans of their own culpability in the narcotics traffic. Narcotics, after all, was flowing into the United States, they claimed, because American soldiers were taking them back to American users. Again, this was their public message. So that was what they said publicly. Privately, however, British and Hong Kong officials were very worried about these criticisms from the United States. There were considerable discussions between the colonial government in Hong Kong and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London about the dramatic upsurge in heroin production and trafficking. There were concerns about how the perception of this out-of-control lawlessness and vice would damage British prestige. And there were concerns about how narcotics not only were flowing to the United States, but also to Europe and even ultimately to the United Kingdom. So by the early 1970s, Hong Kong was already a major narcotics trafficking center. This emergence was propelled by Hong Kong's economic rise, its deepening connections with the global economy, and this emergence as a trafficking center also placed great stress on the Anglo-American relationship. It reinforced this image of Hong Kong as a city of vice, a city of lawlessness in the minds of American officials and the American public. So what happened? So it was at this point when relations between the United States and Great Britain reached a low point over narcotics in Hong Kong, that actually both sides were already moving towards closer cooperation. In fact, even as Congressman Lester Wolff traveled to Hong Kong to vent his frustrations over the lack of progress, officials from the United States, Great Britain, and Hong Kong were already collaborating on a new war on drugs. A key figure in this Anglo-American war on drugs was Norman Rolfe, who was appointed to the newly created position of Commissioner for Narcotics in June of 1972. He would direct the Hong Kong police to intensify and redouble their anti-trafficking crackdowns. So intensifying policing was one thing that Rolfe pushed for. But Rolfe also offered a new strategy, a new rethinking of the anti-narcotics efforts in Hong Kong. In late 1972, he produced a series of memorandums outlining the narcotics problem in Hong Kong. And the main message of these memos was that Hong Kong can't do anything about the problem. It really can't do anything about the problem without addressing the international dimension, basically cutting off the flow of supply from the Golden Triangle at their source rather than on the streets of Hong Kong. The idea was that if heroin was left Thailand, by the time it got even to the border of Hong Kong, it was already too late. So basically, Rolfe saw the narcotics problem not just as a domestic Hong Kong issue, but as an international problem. Now, these memos were circulated not just in Hong Kong, but also among British diplomats throughout Southeast Asia and officials in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Home Office back in London. Their contents and recommendations were debated, were analyzed, and they were given serious consideration. Now, these memos were also read by American officials, one of whom was John Ingersoll, the gentleman standing on the right. He was the director of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, or BNDD, which was the forerunner to today's Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. Now, at this time, the BNDD was charged with spearheading the Nixon administration's war on drugs. The BNDD was very eager for, to demonstrate some tangible victories given the public outcry and the focus on narcotics by the administration. Securing British cooperation was something that the BNDD really sought. American officials complained that they were basically alone in fighting narcotics trafficking in Southeast Asia. Whether this was actually true or not, it's not important, but it's the most important fact is that they felt that they were alone. They thought they were alone. This desire to share the burden was a reflection also of Cold War politics, a reflection of the emerging Nixon doctrine, in which the United States sought to shift some of its geopolitical responsibilities to local allies. This was the idea that American allies can and should help step up. Now, international cooperation did yield some dividends in the global campaign against opium and heroin trafficking. The United States, for instance, was able to close or partially close the Turkish pipeline by leaning on the Turkish government and working very closely with the French and Canadian governments. So in turning their attention to the Southeast Asian pipeline, American officials hoped to replicate this collaboration by working with Great Britain and Hong Kong. So in May of 1973, Director Ingersoll, along with American diplomats in London, requested a trilateral meeting between American, British, and Hong Kong law enforcement officials about the narcotics problem. Ingersoll sent a letter to the Home Office while the American ambassador visited the Foreign Office. So this trilateral meeting was something that the Americans really wanted. There was some debates among American and Hong Kong officials about whether this was actually sorry, one second. This was actually, whoops. I apologize. There was some debates among British and American officials about the wisdom of holding these kind of trilateral meetings, but in the end, they decided to hold the meeting. And each side would bring their own interests into the collaboration. As I mentioned, American officials wanted allies to fight trafficking in Southeast Asia, which they felt that they did not have. Hong Kong officials needed international assistance, but they could not secure international assistance on their own because they were a colony. British officials wanted to repair their relationship with the United States and improve its international image. More importantly, British officials thought they could piggyback on the resources of the Americans to fight a problem that was also beginning to threaten the United Kingdom. So in some ways, this was a convergence of interests. These discussions ultimately culminated in what eventually became a series of trilateral meetings. The so-called Working Committee on Narcotics Control met annually for 2 to 3 days on a rotating basis. The first meeting was held in Hong Kong in 1973. Then the second meeting was held in DC in 1974. And then finally, the last meeting was held in London in 1975. These meetings served as a forum for drug enforcement officials from 3 different governments to coordinate their efforts. Officials from the BNDD, later the DEA, the FBI, the Home Office, and the Hong Kong Narcotics Bureau. Now, from what I can tell, all the officials in attendance were men, and they were all British and American. As far as I can tell, no ethnic Chinese was actually present in these high-level discussions, even though Hong Kong was the center, was the reason why they had to collaborate. The Working Committee established an agenda that they developed and refined over the 3 years that they met. This agenda including coordinating law enforcement efforts, trying to hold joint operations between 3 governments across international lines, The agenda also recognized the importance of cracking down on the trawler traffic, those ships coming from Thailand, which was the main conduit of narcotics from Thailand into Hong Kong. The committee also agreed that the three governments would share intelligence and exchange scientific information. They would alert officials in Hong Kong or the United States for any kind of suspicious shipments. In the following years, the Anglo-American war on drugs unfolded across Southeast Asia. American officials worked closely with British officials in Thailand, for instance. In Hong Kong, meanwhile, local police intensified their crackdown with more arrests, more raids, more interdictions, and more laws. The Hong Kong Narcotics Bureau also would appoint an official who would be stationed in Thailand to coordinate efforts. Now, one sign of success trumpeted by the Hong Kong police and the local media was the dramatic rise in narcotics prices, which jumped by several 100% from 1973 to 1976. This is the data that I happen to have. Increased prices, this jump in prices was viewed as the result of less supply. The idea was that opium, morphine, and heroin and other narcotics were becoming more expensive because of the crackdown, because of the shortages of supplies. Another sign of success came with some very high-profile arrests. One such case was the arrest of Nsek Ho. Sorry if I got that one wrong. Wu Xihao, who was known as Mr. Big, was reportedly one of Hong Kong's biggest drug kingpins. He was an ethnic Teochew who headed one of the leading trafficking organizations that stretched from Hong Kong to Thailand. His arrest, he was arrested in his home in Kowloon Tong in a very nice mansion, apparently. That was seen as a major victory for the campaign. Another high-profile case was the arrest of several former Thai parliamentarians. This was a joint operation between the American DEA and the Hong Kong Narcotics Police. They were able to lure these Thai officials to come to Hong Kong, where they were arrested after a sting operation. They could not be arrested in Thailand, so they convinced them to, hey, why don't you come to Hong Kong? They came to Hong Kong, they arrested them. Now, these arrests provided Hong Kong officials very convenient examples of their commitment to fighting narcotics and cooperating with the Americans. Whatever their impact on the drug trade, these arrests provided considerable public relations boost for the Hong Kong government. And indeed, very quickly, American and international perceptions of Hong Kong and the colonial government would begin to shift. And by the mid-1970s, Hong Kong was trumpeted as a success in the global war on drugs. And it received considerable favorable press coverage. And American appreciation for their Hong Kong and British allies was expressed in all sorts of ways. I'm going to try to jump through a few of these slides. So for instance, they would invite the Commissioner for Narcotics when he retired to congratulate him at the American Consul General. The American Consul General at the end of the 1970s would also write an article praising the fact that Hong Kong was no longer this major trafficking center. And also, by the end of the 1970s, Lester Wolff, Congressman Lester Wolff, who was once a very harsh critic of British efforts and Hong Kong efforts, would later turn into an unabashed admirer. You can see here in the slide some of the things that he said, where he started off saying, all the drugs that is coming into the United States is coming from Hong Kong. By the end of the 1970s, he is actually praising Hong Kong, praising the Hong Kong government, thanking them for helping the Americans combat this scourge. And indeed, by the early 1980s, the American government would begin to turn its attention to another narcotic, namely cocaine from Latin America. So this provides sort of an overview of the Anglo-American war on drugs. And now I want to shift. I want to take the last, say, 5-10 minutes to shift the perspective of this drug war from American and British officials to the Hong Kong Chinese public itself. And I want to explore some of the local consequences of this global campaign. So by the early 1970s, Hong Kong's emergence as a narcotics hub generated considerable notoriety across the world, but it also generated notoriety within Hong Kong itself. Indeed, the Hong Kong Chinese public was often confronted with these headlines that painted a city of violence, vice, and lawlessness. In the public imagination, violent crime, petty thefts, drug trafficking, drug abuse, these were all symptoms of broader social decay in the colony. And public discontent over the colonial government's seeming impotence to do something about this explosion of crime eroded the legitimacy of British colonial rule. As many scholars have already noted, the 1970s was a decade of dramatic change in state-society relations in Hong Kong. In an effort to bolster its legitimacy, head off rising discontent among the Hong Kong Chinese public, the Hong Kong colonial government embarked or continued many campaigns, many social welfare programs. They would increase spending for public housing and public education, tackling local corruption, investing in public infrastructure. This was not done out of necessarily the goodness of the heart of the Hong Kong government, but also driven by public pressure to force the government to act. So this is the local context for the Anglo-American war on drugs that we should really keep in mind, because this was an effort by the Hong Kong government not only to satisfy an increasingly critical American ally, but also an increasingly critical Hong Kong public. The anti-narcotics campaign was also waged along other reforms of the 1970s to bolster British rule over the colony. And the anti-narcotics campaign also dovetailed with another campaign of the 1970s, the so-called Fight Crime campaign of 1973. The Fight Crime campaign was a public relations and public education campaign. The government sought to educate and encourage Hong Kong residents to report suspicious activities, while the police would intensify policing over a 4-week period. The campaign was mostly directed against violent and petty crimes, crime like theft, robbery, and so forth, but it also coincided with the broader anti-narcotics campaign. So these campaigns were not necessarily the same, but they were unfolding simultaneously. The campaign received considerable public attention. It was featured in newspapers of all kinds, from pro-communist newspapers like the Da Gong Bao to pro-Kuomintang papers like the Gongsun Evening News. Newspaper articles also showed, for instance, the campaign's logo, the broken knife, the symbol of crime. I also found this newspaper article that described how the Fight Crime campaign was even featured on one of the most popular television shows at the time, Enjoy Yourself Tonight, 歡樂今宵, 歡樂今宵, which many of you might remember, or maybe some of you might remember, as a very popular weeknight variety show. This show featured the Fight Crime campaign in a special May 1973 episode. So my point here is that this campaign received considerable public attention. If you were living in Hong Kong at this time, you definitely heard about it somehow. I should also note that this campaign was also broadly supported. Fighting crime was a very popular cause in Hong Kong. Editorials encouraged readers to support and participate in the campaign. Local organizations, local chambers of commerce pledged to support the campaign. If there were any criticism of the campaign, they were not directed at the campaigns themselves, or how they were waged, or whether they were too harsh, or whether they fell too much on petty criminals rather than say major leaders. Instead, what most of these critiques was articulated on how short or how brief the campaign was. In fact, many Hong Kong newspapers and magazines would complain that they should do more to fight crime. They should continue the campaign. Even criticisms like this political cartoon on the right. The idea was they were kind of criticizing the campaign's relative brevity. The idea that after 4 weeks now the crooks can go back to work. Let's see. And finally, I'll just say that this campaign, the popular press at the time was also, in many ways, the Chinese press was also, their opinion about the narcotics problem was strangely very similar to the English language or the British press about how the problem of narcotics in Hong Kong had an American source, in the sense that there was a lot of blame that was being directed at Hong Kong that many people in Hong Kong felt was very unfair. In fact, there were a lot of newspaper articles and editorials complaining how this drug problem was driven by American demand for drugs and American permissiveness. There was another editorial in Mingbao, which is a fairly mainstream newspaper at the time, basically complaining that the reason why Americans have this problem is that they're not tough enough, is that they don't execute drug traffickers. We should do that here in Hong Kong. This kind of law and order rhetoric that they were employing. Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap this up with a few quick conclusions. So I think that this Anglo-American war on drugs is a classic example of what one historian calls the tail wagging the dog, meaning that smaller allies, smaller countries were able to appropriate the agendas or solicit the assistance of larger powers. In this case, from what I can tell, I think the biggest beneficiary of the campaign was not the United States, and it wasn't even Hong Kong, but I think it was actually Great Britain, who was able to repair its relations with a very close Cold War ally and reassert and reaffirm its control over Hong Kong. And then another major conclusion that I want to think about, that I want to develop, is understanding sort of like the local consequences of these broader campaigns, how these big policy shifts, at the very high level would unfold in a place like Hong Kong, how they would, the unintended consequences of some of these campaigns. And these are sort of the angles that I like to explore a bit more, and I would very much welcome your feedback. And with that, I'm going to finally end. Thank you very much, Ghassan, for indulging me. I know I went too long. But I'm ready to take questions now. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Thank you so much for that very fascinating talk. We already have the first few questions, so I think we should just delve in. The first question comes from Elaine Bernal, and she asks about. I think you alluded to that already, but she asked about any connections in regards to the war on drugs in Hong Kong, I guess, between Southeast Asia and the Vietnam War.
Definitely. There was a connection in the sense that there were many military officials or soldiers stationed in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, making them very prime consumers for any kind of narcotics. Also, Hong Kong at this time was a rest and recreation center for soldiers from American soldiers in Vietnam who traveled to Hong Kong and were sort of famous or infamous for buying narcotics. In fact, so many American servicemen died of an overdose, of heroin overdose in Hong Kong, that the American military had to eventually stop. Hong Kong's role had to end sending troops or sending soldiers to Hong Kong. And this was one of the criticisms that the Chinese public would also use against the Americans, saying, you Americans who come here to our city, you buy drugs or you bring drugs, and you guys die of overdose and you blame us, that kind of rhetoric.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Jay Wilberforce, who's asking basically about the police. So he asks, were there issues about quote-unquote trusting the cops, who can often be criminal and drug dealers themselves? Basically, how do people know who to trust, really? I guess it's generally about how trustworthy people felt that the police themselves were.
Yeah, this was a critical issue in the 1970s when police corruption was a major problem. Many of you in Hong Kong undoubtedly know about the history of the case of Peter Godber, the British police chief superintendent. I forgot his title. He was in the British police, and when he retired, upon retirement, they discovered that he had millions of dollars in savings, in bank accounts all over the world, which was very outsized money for a policeman. And that case became a very prime example of sort of British corruption in Hong Kong. And there were a lot of instances where people were asking themselves, how, to what extent are the police actually serving the public interest, and to what extent were they serving lining their own pockets. Difficult to say. I don't actually, my own research on this, drug war is not necessarily trying to understand to what extent corruption was pervasive or not. My interests mainly look at sort of diplomatic engagement at a very high level, and then how does it unfold how did it translate some of these this engagement for local people, like ordinary people, the public in a place like Hong Kong.
Right. The next two questions really come from Quinton Huang. And he asks, so for the firstly, he asks, I'm curious if you found any indication that urban renewal squatter clearance was connected with the anti-narcotics campaign and associations of squatter areas with lawlessness and drug use. Letching off your opening example of the Kowloon walled city, he says he's seen in archives that high-level police commanders had to sign off on anti-drug operations in the walled city because of the political sensitivity around the area, and that drug operations in the area had to be carefully coordinated. I think, he also asks, I think that we've sort of already answered the bit on possible corruption in the police government, but he also asks about contrasting coverage between pro-Beijing, quote-unquote, newspapers like Da Gong Bao and pro-government newspapers like the SCMP.
Yeah, that's one thing that I wanted to, let me take the second question. I was very insistent on not just looking at English language, like papers like South China Morning Post, but also Chinese, and not just Chinese newspaper, but like pro-Beijing and, pro-KMT or KMT-backed newspapers, just to get a sense of the differences in coverage. I think that one thing that struck me was that when it came to talking about the issues of crime, I mean, both of them were also talking about, splashing these stories about, crime on the rise, so-and-so got robbed, and I get the impression that whatever their differences in interpretation in pinpointing the cause, so for instance, in pro-Beijing papers, the American military, the so-called invading American military, that's highlighted quite a bit. That's not exactly a point that's highlighted in other Chinese language newspapers. There is a difference in emphasis, but this was very similar in the topics that they would cover. But I'm starting to wade into this. I've only started to collect some of these reports, so I would appreciate if anyone is an expert in 1970s popular opinion and newspaper opinions in Hong Kong, please let me know. Especially, and the question about the Kowloon walled city, I am fully familiar with the political sensitivity related to the Kowloon walled city with the narcotics raid. I am starting to read up more on that. So if there's any recommendations that you could offer on existing research, I would be happy to consider that. So I appreciate that.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from our colleague Alistair McClure. He says, thank you for a really interesting talk. I really learned a lot about these global connections. I had a question about the domestic impact of these concerns about drugs on criminal law and penal control in Hong Kong, which you touched on in the conclusion. I was thinking about what people like David Garland have traced about the role of this period and these new anxieties around drugs and crime in the larger turn towards a neoliberal logic of penalty. In that context, I was interested what that history looks like in the particular context of colonial Hong Kong. Did it bring about similar substantive changes to how crime and punishment was organized and practiced with more broadly?
Thank you very much. The answer is yes. I'm a legal historian, so I'm very sensitive to changes in laws and regulation. And one of the side part of this paper that I'm looking at is trying to collect the laws that were passed, dangerous drugs ordinances, several, different degrees of punishment and so forth. I've already started putting a tentative table together. My general impression for now, and this is just an impression, was that many of these anti-drug laws started to be passed, started to be formulated, promulgated during the late 1960s. But they would escalate in some of the penalties and severities changed some of their penalties and severity by the 1970s. It would be great if I could see sort of this one-to-one match with this escalation of the war, escalation in penalties, which leads to more incarceration and whatnot. This is an angle that I would like to address in my paper, but I've only taken tentative steps towards that by identifying and listing chronologically the passage and formulation of these laws.
All right, great, thanks. The next question comes from Paul Craitman. Thank you for a great talk. American anxiety about drug use and abuse has often been strongly racialized. Were there any racial, class, ideological undercurrents that shaped Hong Kongers' attitudes towards drug use?
Yes, that's a really great point, because in many of the popular press reports and even in American government reports, in addition to blaming British permissiveness, British aloofness, they also blamed Chinese indifference. The Chinese they don't seem to care about this, even though that's a terrible problem. But of course, when you look at Chinese press reports, they do care quite a bit about it. So I think that this is something that I'm still developing and still exploring, but I do think there is this discourse which not only racializes deviance and drug consumption, drug abuse, but also the lack of interest in, the Chinese, quote unquote, in dealing with this issue. And of course, our poor American servicemen who are seduced by heroin being offered in Hong Kong, that kind of discourse was also being used in American official and public circles.
Thank you. The next question comes from Angie Becker, and she asked, did the campaigns against narcotics substantially increase the capacities of the carceral state in Hong Kong, such as increases in the size of the police force or the capacity of prisons?
Yes, I am still exploring that. I am very much attuned to the relationship between policing power and state power. That was something that was a key concern of my book, my first book. And in this article, I'm also interested in exploring that. I'm not sure if I can find a one-to-one relationship, but definitely, there were another major statistics that they like to cite, besides the fact that Hong Kong had the highest number of addicts on a per capita basis, was that some other statistic they cited was like Hong Kong also had the highest number of addicts in prison on a per capita basis or something like that. I have to double check that. Again, I'm not sure if that's objectively true, but the point is that a lot of people use that language and they probably believed it to be true, probably thinking that Hong Kong was overflowing with addicts on the streets and in the prisons.
Yeah, interesting. The next question comes from Alistair Su. Empirically speaking, was it true that opiates were coming to the US through Hong Kong, or was it just a false perception? If it was actually the case, why did it come through Hong Kong and not from other sources like Latin America or Europe?
Thank you very much. There was this perception that a lot of these drugs were flying in from Hong Kong. So by the end of the 1970s, when due to collaboration between the American, Hong Kong, and British government, they were able to use scientific methods to sort of identify whether a specific type of heroin that's found in the United States, for instance, came from Southeast Asia or came from Turkey. And they estimated that at one point, 15% of narcotics of heroin in the United States came from Southeast Asia via Hong Kong. Although they were saying this was an estimate, they're not sure. It could be much higher, actually. So objectively speaking, I don't know how much of this actually came through Hong Kong. But I do know that at least in the early 1970s, the American government thought that a lot of it came, especially like Congressman Wolff, who basically said, we closed the pipeline in Turkey. Well, where is all this coming from? It must be coming from Hong Kong. Whether that's true or not, again, it's hard to say for now.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Talmor Joe. Hi Philip, thanks for the wonderful talk. Did the drugs also go back and forth between China's border with Hong Kong? Wondering if the underground network also expanded to southern Guangdong. And if I could add to that, I was also sort of wondering whether you could say a bit more about what was the role of the PRC in all of this? I mean, does it play a role at all? Did they not care, or did they try to make some kind of use of all this whole problem?
Yeah, so at this time in the early 1970s, we have to remember this was also the age of Sino-American rapprochement. There was also a lot of discussion between American and British officials thinking like, could we ask the Chinese, could we ask the PRC to actually help us with this? And they, according to their correspondences, first, they don't think that this drug problem had a cross-border dimension with China, at least not in this 1970s. There was also concern maybe that was China participating in this trafficking? They said, well, we don't have any evidence that they were. And even if they were, most of it was coming from that Golden Triangle region. I mean, if it came at all, it probably came from Yunnan. But there's no, again, they were speculating. They said, you know what, we really don't actually have any proof. So the PRC was this country that lurked in the background. That was mentioned very often. There were considerations of, well, is China playing a role? And if not, would they be interested in helping us? Could they help us? But these were mostly discussions. As far as I can tell, there were some entreaties or some invitations to talk to Chinese officials. But sometimes, especially in the early 1970s, some of the answers that they would get would be like, drug abuse is a foreign imperialist problem, and you guys should deal with it. That kind of rhetoric. So this was during the 1970s when Maoism was still at its apogee. So it was not surprising that you hear that kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, great, thanks. That's really interesting. The next question comes from Dylan Suha. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how this story fits into a longer history of the opium trade in the Greater Bay Area.
I think that the 1970s probably, it basically, there are a lot of other directions, other vectors of trafficking that did not extend across, say China, but Hong Kong was becoming enmeshed in this web with other areas, other countries, other regions, Macau, Southeast Asia, and then also Taiwan. There's actually a lot of cases where drug dealers, drug kingpins or traffickers, once they are uncovered in Hong Kong, they flee to like Taiwan. Apparently going to Taiwan, it was a major place to evade the reach of Chinese law, and vice versa, by the way. I'm still definitely looking into this. I mean, it starts becoming a problem for the Greater Bay Area in the 80s and definitely by the 90s. 70s, I'm not quite sure.
Okay, we have another question. It says, I'm curious whether the UN was involved in the investigations at all, at the behest of either the US or UK. Also, if I remember correctly, the PRC, shortly after joining the UN in the early 1970s, requested Hong Kong to be removed from the UN's list of colonies. Did this have an impact on the international dynamics of the investigations?
That's a great question, because one thing in reading the files, British and American files, but also mostly British files, the British government, the Home Office, was actually fairly kind of like reluctant to actually participate in this trilateral working group. A lot of them say we would actually prefer that this be dealt with through the UN Ad Hoc Committee on Narcotics. I guess this was at the time when the UN participation in UN work was still viewed as very important. Whereas I think Hong Kong and the American governments were agitating for more cooperation, not at the UN level. But that's a question that I would like to actually resolve, because this is something they do talk about. And I'm not quite, for anyone who might have more information on that, I would be very curious to hear more. If you can make some recommendations for readings and so forth.
Great. The next question comes from John Karp. Great talk. Have you looked at a different level at a different level of Hong Kong American cooperation in terms of the drug problem, the various drug treatment centers, some of them run by American and British missionary organizations.
Thank you. Yes, drug treatment was another sort of pillar of this other campaign. I'm trying to finalize this, but I have some information that the American government actually funded Hong Kong government efforts to build databases for drug addicts, drug treatment. I want to actually not just look at this Anglo-American war on drugs at the law enforcement level, but also on treatment level and also funding level. Because I actually would love to know how much money, if any, the American government was funneling to the Hong Kong or the British government for all this. I don't get the sense that it was a lot. But I do want to identify where some of the sources of funding, if any, and targets of funding. So this is something I'd like to think about. Missionaries, I haven't looked into that just yet, but I would definitely like to explore that angle.
Great. Yeah. There's another question now from Elaine Bernal. She should have asked, I'm curious about what type of chemical scientific information was exchanged, among which parties, how was information exchanged, and what kind of like drug formulations?
Well, Elaine is a friend who is a chemist. She probably understands the chemistry of heroin much better than I do. Apparently, there's some kind of chemical called acetic. I forgot what it's called. It's what is needed to transform morphine and opium into heroin. That chemical, for instance, was discussed. The American and the British and the Hong Kong government discussed maybe ways to limit the export or the use of that chemical. That was actually something that was I believe there was an import sort of ban or something like that, or some kind of control over that chemical. And there were other scientific information exchange based on identifying the drugs, maybe like having some kind of chemical fingerprint. Things like that. There was also discussion of maybe putting homing beacons on Thai trawlers, but sort of like proto GPS, I suppose. But they said that was impractical at the time.
Yeah. Another question that sort of builds again asks about the PRC, whether the PRC was able to exploit Hong Kong's reputation as a den of drugs to try to undermine British rule there, or on the other hand side, if the PRC used this contemporary problem to sort of point back to the pre-49 problems with opium and Britain and US role in that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm actually looking at some mainland newspapers, some PRC newspapers, to see how they might have covered this war on drugs. I would be very curious if anyone has done already. I'm sure someone has done some kind of research on Chinese PRC newspapers' coverage of Hong Kong, how they portrayed the colony, during the 1960s and I'm sure during the 1970s, before a decisive shift occurred, with the reform era, when Hong Kong was now labeled, was now viewed as this modern or more economically developed area. I would actually like to understand if there's any kind of research anyone can point me to. I would appreciate that.
Right. And then possibly a final question. Zhang Zhixiang asks about American fleets. How did the British deal with issues which were related to American fleets and drugs, I guess?
So there was discussion within the Foreign Commonwealth Office. They made actual visits to the British Navy asking, hey, is it possible for you guys to interdict these Thai trawlers? And the British Navy basically says, no way, we can't, the sea is too big. There's a lot of questions of international law. And then there's also issues of, just the fact that there's just these trawlers are everywhere. They're small, hard to trace. You're better off just, if you're going to do this, you're better off, fighting, fighting the trafficking at the source, like in Thailand, not on the high seas. And the Americans actually more or less do the same thing on that. So there may have been more, they offered surveillance, monitoring, and so forth, but most of the fight was going to occur on land, in Thailand. Basically, the idea was to take the campaign as close to the source as possible. Once drugs leave the source, it becomes more difficult.
If I may jump in for just a second, Philip, great project. Looking forward to hearing more about it, learning more from your research. The situation you're talking about, it is a business after all, unsavory as it might be. And I wonder how much of this episode in the late 60s, early 70s, or throughout the 70s, how that disrupted the flows of both goods and capital into and out of Hong Kong. Or if we were to look at the continuities thereof, when you were showing us the maps, it's actually quite interesting that the old footprint was still there. Turkish opium, Tiuzhou trade in Thailand. So it's very much embedded in an existing network of drug trade, but also legitimate trade as well. And most important of which is rice from Thailand. So I wonder how much of that actually happened, either in the context of growing trade, legitimate trade in Hong Kong, or could that have happened without that? And also, if you were to look at the circulation in a more abstract way locally in Hong Kong, you alluded to that already with the corruption issues and the government steps thereof. The two arrests that you mentioned, both of Bai Ho, that's the one that's how he goes by in my younger days, and also Godbar as well. That was quite a orchestrated campaign of the local government, basically in wresting power from the underground world. So there's also a rewiring of the circuitry thereof as well, which in Hong Kong we tend to think very locally within the city, but then obviously it's embedded in a global event as well. So I wonder if you can comment on those issues.
Thank you very much, John. I think that one thing that struck me in looking at Hong Kong's emergence as this global narcotics center was how these trafficking patterns or vectors piggybacked on existing networks and connections. One reason why Hong Kong was becoming this emporium for narcotics was because it became a major tourist center. One reason why you could take drugs and fly it all the way around the world, whether it's to Australia, whether it's to the Philippines, or from Thailand, or to Amsterdam, or to San Francisco, or even New York, is because of Hong Kong's connection as a major export hub. These connections, which were built for quote unquote legitimate commerce, were basically being appropriated. I mean, with these big cargo shipments, you had shipments of all kinds. I think that that's a very interesting question about how this campaign, this war on drugs, might have affected legitimate businesses or semi-legitimate businesses. That's not something I've looked at just yet, but I am sure that because of this campaign, travel to and from Hong Kong became much more scrutinized. Also, if you were from Thailand, your luggage was going to get searched, no doubt about it. And they were going to, cast a much stricter eye on any ships or fishing vessel coming in from, Thailand or whatever. So there might be more monitoring, more surveillance, more registration that was introduced as a result of this crackdown, as a result of this intensification of enforcement. How that affected legitimate trade, I don't know, but I'm sure it's that's why your luggage is going to get searched more likely. Although, as we all know, going to Hong Kong, sometimes you can just push your cart right through the no declaration channel sign. I don't know how that was in the 1970s. I forgot what else. Did I answer your questions, John? I don't. I'm sorry, yes. I don't remember all.
Yes, thank you.
Great. I think we've unfortunately run out of time, so I'd like to use this opportunity to once more thank Philip for the wonderful talk and for taking the time. I know that it's quite late already in the US to speak to us, and I think all the many questions that you so patiently answered show how much interest there is in your research, and we're all looking forward to to learning more. So thank you very much. Before we close, I should mention that the Chinese Business History webinar will return on the 26th of March, when we will hear from Dr. Yuan Yi of Columbia University, and she will talk about the global history of Chinese cotton mills in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I hope to see many of you again then. Thank you again thank you, Philip. Thank you again for the talk, and thank you all for attending. And I hope that we see you for the next seminar in March again. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Take care.